To kick off today's programming, our first panel will discuss efforts underway across the nation to redesign college admissions. They will begin by exploring some national and state trends in public perceptions of higher education, as well as innovative strategies being used to break down barriers, make admissions more responsive to the needs of all students, and improve public trust in the value of higher education. Our moderator for this discussion will be Stephanie Markin. Ms. Markin is a senior partner at Gallup, leading its U.S. Custom Research Division, which includes research programs Gallup performs on behalf of foundations, agencies, corporations, and institutions of higher education. She is responsible for the strategic direction of Gallup's research in education, workforce development, climate, technology, and the social sciences, which includes complex, multi-mode, qualitative, and quantitative research projects. Please join me in giving our panel a warm welcome to the stage.
So grateful to the coordinating board for allowing me to be a part of this great discussion and a part of the conference. I'm going to start off by just introducing our great panelists. You have their bios, but they bear repeating because they're amazing experts in the area that we'll talk about here today around value and admissions as a method to really improving access and completion of a post-secondary credential. And then I'll share a little bit about some of our trends in higher education before we transition to our discussion. So I'll start with you, David, because you're a lot of the reason I think a lot of us are here today. So thank you for convening us all. For those of you who don't know David is Deputy Commissioner of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, where he leads the divisions for academic and health affairs, college and career advising, student success, digital learning, and data management and research. With nearly 2 decades of experience dedicated to Texas higher education, he's been instrumental in driving initiatives such as the Building a Talent Strong Texas Strategic Plan and the Governor's Tri-Agency Workforce Initiative. Nationally recognized for his leadership in higher education policy and data analysis, David plays a pivotal role in fostering collaborations that connect academic outcomes with labor market demands. We're also joined by Jonathan Gagliardi. Jonathan is one of the leading scholars on evidence-based organizational transformation, higher education, and the founding vice president of the Office of Economic Mobility and Social Impact for Northern Arizona University. Previously at the City University of New York, Jonathan was Assistant Vice Chancellor for Academic Effectiveness and Innovation. In that role, he spearheaded efforts to drive upward mobility and opportunity for students through system-wide strategic planning and student-centered, equity-driven policies and programs. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan. We also have Sarah Scudder here with us this morning. Sarah is the College and Career Access Officer at the Idaho State Board of Education, providing us important geographic diversity, where she manages multiple state education programs, including Idaho's Direct Admissions Program, the Common College Application Apply Idaho, state scholarships, and Next Steps Idaho, a homegrown college and career advising platform. She began her career at a survey research firm, like all great careers belong. She began where her analytical thinking and aptitude for numbers led to rapid promotion and recognition by the Idaho Department of Labor. While at the department, she played a key role in launching and promoting several statewide initiatives, including the Future in Action AmeriCorps project, the Inspiring Futures VISTA program, and the Idaho Career Information System. She continues her impactful work at the Idaho State Board of Education. And finally, we have with us Dr. Shannon Goodman. Mr. Goodman joined the University of North Texas in 2015 as the founding vice president for enrollment. He is responsible for building an enrollment management operation that achieves sustainable enrollment growth while balancing both quality and accessibility. As a transformational leader in higher education, his impact at UNT has enabled the institution to experience sustained record enrollment growth of 23% since his arrival. And today, UNT is one of the 4th largest universities in Texas, with over 46,000 students. Goodman has more than 35 years of experience in higher education, working in proprietary community college and public universities, serving in both technical and functional roles. Thank you all for being here today. You can see why this is such an esteemed panel of experts to guide our conversation and discussion. I'd like to start off with just a few trends that we've been tracking at Gallup that are relevant to this conversation. David kindly teed me up to share some of our research around confidence in higher education, as well as perceptions of value of a post-secondary degree or credential. For those of you who are less aware of our work, for several decades, Gallup has been tracking attitudes towards post-secondary education and really education and training beyond high school. And in that process, we've asked a lot of questions about value and affordability and accessibility. At the same time, we've also been tracking confidence in various institutions in American society. The military, small business, big business, Congress. No one does worse than Congress, so that's the good news. Everyone's above them. The presidency, the Supreme Court. And in 2015, we added higher education officially to that list. We thought we should be asking about confidence in the overall industry. of higher education as opposed to just these individual questions around affordability and accessibility. And when we started measuring 2015, more than half of U.S. adults believed in the value of a post-secondary education. They said that they believed that they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the industry in general. And then when we asked again in 2018, we saw a decline. In 2023, that number went all the way down to 36% from about 60% of Americans, which for us is a pretty significant decline over a short period of time at Gallup when we consider all of the trends in which we're tracking in the greater U.S. society. At that time, what we found was one of the sharpest declines was among Republicans, but really all groups had declined over time. Democrats, individuals who tend to be more positive about the value of a post-secondary degree, people who they themselves have additional education and training beyond high school, as well as individuals who identify as underrepresented, racial and ethnic minorities. So the decline, while sharper among Republicans, has really persisted among all groups. In June of 2024, when we were set to survey again, we thought, well, it's probably going to decline again, right? Because if you take yourself back to June of 2024, you'll recall that we were coming off of the heels of quite a lot of media coverage about protests happening nationally. So we thought, well, it'll probably decline again. What was interesting to us is the percent of Americans who said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence actually didn't decline this year. But the percent that said they had very little or no confidence did increase slightly. That's now just at about 36% as well. So we have a more closely divided than ever percent of Americans who have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence and very little or no confidence, with about a third being somewhere in the middle on that important question. We also asked for the first time this year, why do you have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence or very little or no confidence in higher education as an industry? Lumina Foundation partnered with us to ask those important follow-up questions to really understand the nuance of how people think about confidence in an industry as opposed to other questions around value or affordability or accessibility. And what we found is for those who said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence, value was actually the number one reason they said that. They also followed that closely by saying that they believed people who had additional education and training beyond high school and had a higher education pathway had just more opportunities available to them. So hopefully that makes you feel good about so much of what you're focused on here. For those who said they had very little or no confidence, one of the major reasons were concerns around political or propaganda indoctrination of students, followed closely by concerns around cost and accessibility. And I think that's so much of what we'll talk about today is just ongoing concerns around costs and just getting more students to and through a post-secondary program. At the same time we've been tracking confidence in higher education, we've also been asking some really fundamental questions about accessibility and affordability, and importantly, value of a post-secondary degree. In partnership with Lumina Foundation, we conduct each year the Gallup Lumina Foundation State of Higher Education Study, which includes interviews with about 14,000 or so U.S. adults who don't they themselves have a degree or credential. Those could include currently enrolled students, folks that have never before enrolled, as well as those who've stopped out temporarily from a post-secondary pathway. And we asked them a series of questions, one of which is how valuable they perceive a series of different post-secondary pathways are as it relates to having a successful career. We asked them to rate a certificate, a certification, a 2-year, 4-year, and graduate degree. And in the fall of 2023, when we surveyed last and reported last, we're coming out of the field right now, by the way, so stay tuned, more data to come. But last year when we surveyed, we found that just about 2/3 of Americans said they believed each one of those pathways was extremely or very valuable. That percentage was actually 75% for the bachelor's degree pathway. A lot of people, when we share our data, always say to me, well, how can that be true? How can people have no confidence and yet they see value in the outcome? And an optimist response would be, well, that's great news, right? Because people believe the system is so broken, yet they also still believe in the outcome. So imagine if you improve the system, what you could deliver for individuals. But I always think of it like this. You know, I can believe that the healthcare system is broken in the United States and also believe going to my doctor will make me a healthier, more well person. And I think people can keep those two things in their mind at the same time. But I think that's really important to interpreting all of the research that Gallup and others are sharing on this important issue of value of a post-secondary pathway. So we're here to talk about accessibility, cost, affordability, how we get more students to and through. So I would love to start with you, David, because as I mentioned, I think you're so much of why each of us individuals are on this panel here today. But you've done so much around this issue of admissions redesign, right? How do we fundamentally change admissions in order to provide a valuable experience, but also make sure that just more students have the opportunity to benefit from a post-secondary degree? You've led really transformative policy efforts here in Texas aimed at improving that student access and success issue. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your perspective on direct admissions and the credential of value framework that you've been working on, and just how you think redesigning that admissions process can really impact students and families.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for my friends and colleagues up here on stage with me. When you say me, it's an us. It's an agency, and so I have to, before I even start talking about the work we're doing, I have to acknowledge all the divisions in our agency that have contributed to this work. First, Commissioner Keaton has really created some great leadership for us to support this effort. I have to talk about college and career advising. So that's Laura Brennan, Molly Gully, Jaslyn Rose, and Daniel Perez. I want to talk about the product team, Michael Kelly, IT, Layla Young, the communication team, Allison Rizzo, data management research, Melissa Humphreys, and then the foundation, Melissa Henderson, and our general counsel, Nicole Bunker Henderson. Without this unified front, we would still be talking about it, honestly. When we talk about direct admissions, it's hard for me to sit still because I get really excited about it. So when we talk about direct admissions, we have to disrupt our way of business in Texas and across the nation. We cannot just assume that people are going to show up. And we are in an age where technology has provided so much convenience for us. Students are so used to just going and asking Siri or going to Netflix and being told, here's a selective movies that you like. We have to reduce the barriers that exist from going from K through 12 to higher education. And the way we can do that is no longer, some days I'll be, since I'm being recorded, I'll be very careful when I say this, but some days I feel like I'm working on a typewriter when it comes to data. We shouldn't be behaving that way. We should be having this flow of data that's organic and creates energy so that a 4-year or a 2-year campus doesn't have to purchase contact information from students in high school through an agency to have this relationship. And we need to start as early as 8th grade. When we start with a rising senior, their junior year in high school, that's too late. We have to create this culture where they're seen, heard, valued, and loved as early as 8th grade so they can start structuring their high school coursework that would set them for success. So we launched direct admissions. We did this in just a few months. And we said, we'll do a pilot. You know, and in Texas, we don't really do pilots. And so the first year out, we had 31 4-year campuses that are public institutions participate in this pilot. And that was amazing. So that's out of 34 campuses that were eligible to participate. And just in 2 months, and so the first approach we did, we created self-reported information. What are 5 questions that we need to know that will help the student automatically be admitted into the institution? Then they would have to provide additional information for the admissions offices to understand what studies, programs of study they'd be admitted to and what types of financial aid they would be eligible for. And in those short 2 brief months that we went live, we've had 10,000 students opt in. 10,000. And we didn't do any press, very little press around this. It was just organic in nature. And when they click the information that the institutions need to know if they're automatically admitted, it will pop up and say, you're automatically admitted into UNT, UT Austin, A&M College Station, a variety of the schools, right? And then behind the scenes, now we have their contact information where we share that with the institutions. So then now we can have this relationship that they can immediately say, Shannon can email someone and say, we're so excited that you opted in. We see you as a UNT student. We're excited to have you. And I think that's what students need to hear. And I know that Commissioner Keaton and I have a very passionate approach to making sure that there's some predictability around higher education and also financial aid, and making sure that students know that they can afford it. And then sifting through all the noise and the Yelp reviews and the whatever they use now, TikTok, Instagram, the list goes on and on, to figure out, yes, it is worth it. And so with our credentials of value, it's tying these programs of study to earnings outcomes and truly understanding, yes, the investment was worth it. It was of value. It was not a credential of harm. And I think we'll have a later session about student success, but we have to make sure that we are creating this entry point for all students so that they can see themselves as college students and make it much easier for them to navigate the hoops that we have created historically.
Awesome. Thanks for kicking us off. Jonathan, I would love for you to talk a little bit about your program at NAU, in part because you have received, I think, a ton of accolades nationally for the work you all are doing. You're really leading in this area. Can you talk a little bit about your universal admissions program, kind of where it is situated within the university and kind of what comes next for it?
Yeah, sure. And I would just echo a lot of what David said about the importance of demonstrating value and articulating that in a way that means something to students, not to us. It's something that we, as a sector, I think have gotten comfortable with, and more what we're learning is that people are looking for more tangible value to come out of their college degrees. And that's really one of the things that led Northern Arizona University, along with 9 of its community college districts and the Arizona Commerce Authority, to create what we call the Universal Admissions Program. And by the way, quick shout out to Melanie Heath, as she's here in the room with the Lumina Foundation. She's been a great supporter of the work, and we're really grateful for the partnership. So why do we go about this? Well, one of the things that we've learned as a state is that our immediate college going rate is 48%. It's one of the worst in the nation. In addition to that, our FAFSA completion rate is the lowest in the nation, as well as our state funding per FTE for public four-year institutions. Long story short of it, it's not a state set up for folks to see a post-secondary education as a viable means to move themselves forward, so they don't go. Now, in addition to that, and I would say this about many other states, when you think about whether or not folks see value in the current system and structure of higher education, it's really crucial to be clear-eyed about it. We've all benefited from the value of a post-secondary education. I love it. I grew up on a college campus, despite the fact that my parents didn't have college educations themselves. But they imparted that wisdom and that experience to me. But when you think about what most students go through these days, the truth of the matter is in Arizona, for example, the 3-year graduation rate at community colleges is somewhere between 20 and 25%. At our 4-year institutions, it's somewhere around 60%. What does that mean? Well, that means that at a 4-year institution, 4 out of every 10 students don't graduate from the place they started at. And at a community college, you've got 7 to 8 students out of every 10 who haven't done that. What that says to me, and what that says to many of the folks up here and around the room, is that those structures aren't working for a ton of people. And when you think of the accumulated failure rates year after year after year after year, is there any doubt as to why more and more people have at least begun to doubt the efficacy of colleges and universities or higher education more broadly as a system? It seems to make sense to me. And we're seeing that play out at this point in time, and that begets the need for some of these large-scale change and reforms that everybody up here at the table are helping to lead in partnership with people who are a part of their team. So that whole soapbox aside. What I would also say is that recognizing that in the state of Arizona, given the state funding and the political climate that we face, and the reality that people just tend not to go to college, we worked with our community colleges to say, well, what if there was an opportunity for us to be able to lower the barriers to entry and to make sure that people knew from the jump in high school, and as David noted, the earlier you do it, the better, that you have a place at a 4-year university or a pathway to a 4-year degree. So that led us to think about, well, why do we send out denial letters to begin with? As someone who received quite a few of them when he was applying to college, the truth of the matter is it doesn't feel good. You feel excluded before you even have an opportunity to enroll or matriculate in courses for the most part. And so for us, as we think about the broader work we're trying to do to elevate upward economic mobility, to think more about social impact, we think about it through a framework that we call ASAP. So how do you lower barriers to access? What can you do to accelerate success? How can you boost attainment? What can you do to promote prosperity? And we think that in a highly reductive way, you do all 4 of those things well, you get to greater economic returns and, as importantly, though less tangible, the social impacts that a more educated citizenry wind up having. And we think in doing that, we can revive the feeling of higher education both as a public good, but also as a personal payoff. So really, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's, don't deny students. Admit them, help them know that they have a pathway to a 4-year degree, whether that's through our community colleges or not, and the message that you're not going to be rejected, that you're a part of our post-secondary ecosystem, and we care about you, is the first step of many that we're taking to try to boost economic mobility in the state.
I love how you talked about the multiple outcomes of a college degree. So often we hear people say, well, you'll earn more, right? And of course, that's true. And there's so much data that's really confirmed that. But we also know that education is for more than just that. And the general public actually agrees on this. In fact, about 2 years ago, we conducted really interesting research in partnership with Lumina Foundation on a study we called Education for What? What is education supposed to be for? And what do Americans think it's for? Do they think it's just for earnings alone, a better job, or a better life? That's what we hear generally qualitatively from individuals. But when we asked individuals what education was for, we found that they generally believed higher levels of entrepreneurship, innovation, highly engaged citizenry was more effective in terms of voting, et cetera. They saw all of those outcomes with a post-secondary degree or credential. And we even looked at additional secondary data from BLS, the CDC, Gallup data, and we looked at individuals with different levels of education to see to what extent were those outcomes present for them. And what we found consistently was for 50 of the 52 outcomes we investigated, there was a significant and important relationship between education beyond high school and those outcomes. Things like disease burden, longevity, overall self-reported health and well-being were all highly correlated. So we know all that to be true, and the general public really does agree with that. And yet they're still having a hard time wrestling with this issue of confidence, I think in part because of the concerns around accessibility. Is this just an elite system that's reserved for the very few? So thanks for mentioning that. I'd love to turn to you next, Sarah, and talk a little bit about how do you look at this from a state perspective, right? Because we've talked about the individual institutions and the system perspective, but you've made this work for Idaho in general. So can you talk a little bit about some of the conditions that existed that led you all to this path of direct admissions?
Sure. So I guess the unique thing about ours is it's run out of our board office, but it was actually an idea born from our University President's Council. So one of our presidents was taking a trip from his institution down to Boise, stopped at a coffee shop, was talking to the server who had said, no, I've never even thought about going to college. And he was like, oh, well, that's really interesting because the state has all this information already about you, and we should be using that to tell you that you are eligible to come to any of our institutions. And so that's really how our program was born, was this idea of there's knowledge that the states have, as David mentioned, a lot of data that can already help students on that pathway. And so our direct admission started in 2015. Unlike you guys, our pilot was our entire state of 8 public institutions, to put it into perspective. And it ran with letters out to students telling them that they had met the admission criteria to our institutions. And so we've been running it. We've made changes along the way, mostly because of different changes out in the environment. So as you're launching your direct admissions program here, just know those aren't static things. Like if you're trying to make changes in your admission policy, it really has to be about what's actually out there happening in the field. A lot of things that we would like to have done differently was bringing in our counselors right at the get-go, because those college and career advisors and counselors that are at the schools, those are the ones that are really going to do that marketing and outreach around what your program means. So it's, we have been very lucky. Ours is also a board policy, so it's not a state legislative intent. So that allows us to make a lot more changes as our institutions are giving us feedback. And the group that we've really seen through our research that has been mostly benefited by this program is those mid-tier students who don't see themselves as college material, and getting this letter that says, hey, you are college material and we want to see you on one of our campuses. And we've gone anywhere from every president signing it to just the governor signing it. And we've had lots of iterations, but the main focus is how do we let the kids in Idaho know that we want them and that they're college material on any of our campuses.
You started off with some important advice about being kind of willing to pivot, it sounds like, is kind of one of your key takeaways. But I'm curious, any other advice you'd share with other folks that are interested in this pathway and scaling this and trying to do so in a state as big as Texas?
Sure. So I think one of the things that we definitely learned was when you said direct admissions, we sent out letters and we thought we were very clear, but most people didn't know who this Idaho State Board of Education even was when they got this letter. Yep. So that took a little bit of time for people to be like, who is this strange entity that we've never heard of sending us this letter? Is it real? We actually had a few kids show up on a campus with their letter in the fall, having never applied. So we had to make sure that it was very clear that this was just like, you've met the admissions standards, but you still have to take that action to let the institution know that you want to show up on their campus in the fall. I think the biggest thing is you have to understand that it's going to radically change the way that your recruiters are working out in that field. I think that was one of the biggest takeaways for us. We did ours in 3 months. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity to get stakeholder engagement and awareness. And so when our institution recruiters found out about the program in a press release, and then they were like, well, what does this mean for us and our jobs? Because now it's not so much, it's about this kid gets the letter, and now you can say, hey, we're the best fit for you. We know you've gotten all these other offers. So being able to proactively talk to your admissions teams about what their job is going to look like when everyone's now been admitted to multiple schools, and they're going to be doing a little bit different work in that respect.
Can I chime in for a
Yeah,
second?
please.
I want to add to that. I think you bring an excellent point. There's a paradigm shift that has to happen with engagement. Especially with high school counselors, I'm really concerned. So we have over 400,000 rising seniors in Texas. So when you look at the student to counselor ratio in high school, what we've done traditionally is allowed students to come to the counselor and talk to them about, I'm interested in going to college, but it's not all students, right? And so I think what we're going to have to do is start engaging with counselors to provide them resources so that all students in their high school come and talk to them about college, and not just the top 10 or top 25%. As a state, we have to move away from this high school rank phenomenon of top 10 or top 25 to figure out, what about the other 75% of the students? And what line of sight could we provide them at a community college or a transfer possibility? And then the other thing that we haven't brought up is affordability and the fear of taking on a cost like this when we know basic needs are at the highest they've been in our country in years. And people are worried about food and shelter. And how do we alleviate that? And there's one thing that I forgot to mention, the FAST program that is part of House Bill 8. So House Bill 8 is sort of the gift that keeps on giving from my perspective. And so if a student is free or reduced lunch, what we know in the data, when you look at our 8th grade cohort, it's called the Texas Talent Trajectory now. We follow students longitudinally. If students are classified as free or reduced lunch in high school, 48% of those students don't even attempt to go to a 2-year or 4-year. With House Bill 8, with the FAST effort, if you're a free or reduced lunch, we are going to make sure that a dual credit course is free. We're also going to make sure that there are no textbooks costs or hidden fees as well. And we have that commitment with the 2 years. And it has gone gangbusters. And that's creating that line of sight of not only direct admissions, but also just saying, I can be a college student, I can be successful. And we're reducing those financial barriers.
I think that issue of affordability too is also about price transparency. What we hear from consumers is that they feel like they don't really understand what it will actually cost to obtain additional education and training beyond high school. Last year, we really wanted to explore this at scale and to see to what extent can people accurately estimate total cost of attendance at an individual institution. And what we found was, we expected everybody would overestimate it. We thought everybody will be really off. They'll hear the Vanderbilt stories of the world and think every institution is $100,000 or more per year to attend. And what we actually found is a lot of people were underestimating. In fact, just about 47% underestimated total cost of attendance for the average student after discounting. We also had about a quarter that were within about 5,000, and then the remainder overestimated the cost. So it was a little counterintuitive to what we expected. But what was interesting is for those who underestimated cost of attendance by more than $5,000 a year, they still said it was too expensive. So it's a good reminder how pressing this issue of affordability is for folks. Shannon, we talked a little bit in your bio about how much UNT has grown and how large the institution is, which tells me you're communicating this issue of value pretty successfully to prospective students. Can you talk a little bit about how you all are thinking about value and what changes are making within the institution to get to that kind of scale from a student population perspective?
Sure. Excuse me. And I think maybe I'll expand the definition of breaking barriers through admissions redesign, and only in the sense of saying that while everything that we've talked about is 100% important, and we've got to do that, and you've got to check, and it's your own institutions, you need to check for your efficiencies or inefficiencies, and you need to make sure you're not putting up barriers that are unnecessary, right? So we're eliminating those. We're making sure people understand that they can afford it, right? All the traditional barriers, right, is, am I qualified, right? So, and I love the fact that you're talking about, which is our belief is we're going to meet you where you're at. We're going to have a path, right? So you can earn your admissions in, right? And so those partnerships are really important, so that it's not just the top 5 or top 25 or whatever. It's the full 100% that we're talking to. But I think what we're seeing as we're starting to look into the data is, so we're having success on that front, and we're still got miles to go, right, before we can sleep in the sense of, it's continuous improvement. But what I'm starting to see in our data, and then David, as we were looking the other day in some of the data that you've produced in the corner, which I'm going to take a minute to get a shout out. If you've not looked at the data that David and his team have produced through the coordinating board, I encourage you to do so. There's an incredible wealth of information out there. So if you're busy trying to find it or build it yourself, you're likely it's already been done for you. So
Thank you.
Shameless plug there, but I mean, I'm a big fan. That's one of the reasons I'm sitting up here. But what we're seeing is that we have students who are both academically eligible. They've been admitted. In fact, they're some of their top students, those top 5, 10, 25% students. They've got the awards. Most of us and these types of students each of you would be giving them academic scholarships. They're also, need-based, or if they're Pell eligible, they're getting Texas grant, et cetera. So the traditional ways that we would look as far as, are you academically eligible? Is that the barrier? Is that what's keeping you out? Or are you, don't have the financial means? These are students that have both of those, and what we were seeing was they were choosing not to go to us, they weren't going anywhere. Mm-hmm. Right? So that gets back to that fundamental question of what is, if you will, the value of education. But where I look at this is, if all we work is on the front end as an institution, as a university, and as an industry, if all we look at is the front end and say, well, the reason they're not coming is because we haven't made it easy enough or sparkly enough or something, and we don't address the product and how we're providing the product and the ways that we're doing that, we're seeing the market's, coming in, and there's people coming into the market. You got Google, Cisco, a lot of people offering credentials, credentials of value, certifications, et cetera. And you don't come into a market unless the market's ripe for picking, right? And so now what that's done is that's confused the market even more. So now we're all competing against each other. We've got these out there, and we're saying, no, ours is better and theirs isn't. So I think we have to really take a stronger look, and I would just encourage you. And so this is something that we're looking at as a university is not just that door, right? And wondering, it's like, well, make the door prettier and make it a little easier to swing, and they'll come in. They're not coming to the store, let alone getting into the door. So we've got to do something different and understand that they wanted, this isn't one of the things we do oftentimes, most of us, is based on, seat time versus street time. And what I mean by that is we set our courses up in the fact that it's going to run a particular period of time, and at that end of time, you're expected to have certain outcomes, learn certain things, and people are realizing that, hey, I can either learn it faster, or maybe it takes a little more time. I want to learn it at my pace. And we're not set up for some of these nuances of the way that they're able to go out. And somebody mentioned like Netflix and stuff like that, right? The consumers, the way they can get information today, and the way they operate in life is very different than the traditional way that we've been set up. So it's a little bit different than what we're talking here, but I would just tell you, it's like you can't just look at one part of the problem. You got to look at the whole, because if we get them in, then it's about retention and graduation. You remember some of the numbers. They don't have a good experience. It's not set up for them to be successful, and then they leave. So it's not just about that front door.
A lot of it boils down to the question, how do you turn need into value? And I don't think that we as a sector are particularly good about doing that. As you noted, Shannon, we tinker around the edges. We want to try to retrofit structures that don't fit what modern students' needs actually are onto students that we then expect to come, despite the fact that we're not meeting their needs. We're just trying to get them to take advantage of something that's slightly repackaged. And so, an analogy for that is somebody walks into a coffee shop and you tell them that you've got 6 different kinds of coffee, and they tell you, well, I don't drink coffee. I drink something else. I'd like some tea or anything like that. We're not diversifying what we offer in addition to how we provide the services that make it easy for a student to learn and earn at the end of it. Which brings me to one other point, which is this idea, Sarah, that you noted about that letter. There's something that's really important to people about things that are tangible. And we live in a very immaterial world in so much that things are bits and bytes and data points and whatever the case may be. Get something on a platform. You don't own an album anymore. It's on your phone. You're going to trade in every 2 years. Yeah. So when people wind up thinking about a college education, they're not thinking of the learning journey. They're thinking about the payoff at the end of it. We're selling a learning journey that is largely intangible and that most people don't reap or see the full value of, often for decades. And only after they've had enough success where they can enjoy the broader social benefits, culture, art, music, whatever the case may be. In the interim, you've got a ton of folks who are worried about taking on what amounts to the cost of a mid-size, medium kind of brand sedan, and they're wondering whether or not they're going to succeed. And the numbers show that they're probably not. That is not a winning value proposition for folks. And so as we begin to think as institutions, as systems, as coordinating boards about what we need to do different, there's a lot that we need to do different. That doesn't take anything away from the value of what we do, but it does speak to the process and the structures that exist and whether they are built for modern students to go through them successfully. And if not, as Shannon noted, they're probably going to go elsewhere if they go anywhere at all. And that's a shame for all of us because, as you mentioned with your data, we know the value of a college education, both tangibly and intangibly.
Go ahead, Dave.
I think also it's no longer an individual decision, it's a family decision. And we have to recognize that how can we both support the prospective student, but also the family members that might likely be in the category of some college no credential.
Mm-hmm.
We're
jaded by the system, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, we have close to 4 million in Texas that have tried, they've attempted, and they didn't succeed with the credential. And so I think there's that angle. And then the thing that I'm trying to always reflect on with the data is the declining high school students across all the states, except like California, Florida, Texas. I'm always anticipating that non-Texas higher education institutions are going to be recruiting our students away from Texas. Mm-hmm. I have to meet a metric of 550,000 credentials of value by 2030. That's 5 years from now. And there's no way I can ever do that unless we increase this pipeline and show some predictability as it relates to the costs and make sure that they're receiving the skills. I always struggle because in higher education we talk about student learning outcomes, but in workforce we talk about skills. In higher education we talk about time to degree. In workforce we talk about time to productivity. Like we need to figure out a way to start cross-pollinating the language so that we can truly tie in student learning outcomes with the skills so that we're meeting the needs of the employers.
And I think to that, right, what we have is while you're seeing the demographic cliff and we're seeing that reduction in high school graduates, it's not like the state's growing, right? So we've got folks moving in. So it's are we positioned to, there's more need out there. I'm convinced there's more need for education and reskilling, upskilling, et cetera, however you want to put it, than we have combined capacity to meet. I believe that's true. So why is, so I don't think we have to be so scared on our competition. I think it's a higher ed industry issue in the value proposition of it. And then we've got to solve it. They're swiping left for a reason, right? They're choosing not to come for a reason. So we need to stop looking at this as, well, it's what is the issue, perhaps, because that was the traditional one, right? We could decide who we wanted to dance with. Right? We were all set up with, we would put this gate or this bar and say, if you're able to get through it or cross it, then you can come in. And then if you can afford it, and then we started to go, oh, that's, the demographics are changing. So we start looking at how do we, redesign that? How do we make it simpler? How do we make sure people understand that, this is for you? How do we make it affordable? So now we've got a proliferation of promise programs, and it's a race to the bottom in the sense of last dollar and everything, right? So all these things are there, which are good in the sense of, I want you to hear me the right way. These things are needed. It's not, it's a yes and is all I'm saying, right? Is we have to do those things. Those are important. So everything that we're doing, direct admissions, and I love it. And in fact, of course, we were wanting to jump in with you because it's absolutely needed. But we got to work the other end of the problem as well. That's all I'm saying in the sense of, because I believe that's a barrier as well, the way that we're positioned as a.
Each of you has talked to some extent about this some college, no degree population, kind of the crisis that they present. I was talking to a leader recently who said, well, I need to get those students back who've stopped out because they're low-hanging fruit. And I'm like, oh, I actually don't know that they're low-hanging fruit, right? Because they had a negative experience that caused them to leave in the first place. And when I talk to those individuals, so much of what we hear is the competing responsibilities issue you raised, David, right? Caregiving, child care, those are real responsibilities that people can't possibly overcome in order to enroll, especially given the cost of care in this country. So I always think that they're a dangerous group for a few reasons, one of which is when you have a negative experience as a consumer, you love to tell other people about it, right? That's just human nature, right? You have a bad experience at a Starbucks or your local restaurant, and you are telling everybody, especially in today's information age, about it.
Now there's Yelp.
Yeah, there's Yelp, there's everything, right? You could review all day long. I think this morning as I check in at my hotel, he's like, swipe this so you can give me a review, the valet. So everybody wants you to review them, and I think that is causing people to share these really negative experiences, and that takes hold, right? As much as I'd love to think our numbers take hold, I'm realistic, and I know that most often what people think about is that their neighbor had a bad experience, and that anecdote really resonates and kind of rings around in their head, even more so than the earnings differential for someone who has a less than a high school degree or diploma and a 4-year degree or credential. Sarah, I'd love to hear from you. We've talked a lot about innovation, what individual states are doing and schools are doing, kind of breaking molds. What do you think gets in the way of this industry or other states in terms of innovating and adopting some of what you all have adopted in Idaho?
Oh, that's a big one. I think a lot of it is really, we are, like we talked about a lot up here, is we have our systems in place. Our systems in our state is fairly small. When I say I have 8 public institutions fully in our program and you're talking about 31 in a pilot. So trying to move the needle with 31 or hundreds or whatever just takes a momentous amount of coordination and getting people on board to say, like, yes, this is the right way to right this ship. We've just been a little bit luckier in Idaho, but that's not to say that we always are not like looking at, is this the right thing? Should we be doing more? We're actually doing a project with Lumina right now. We had completely dropped college entrance exams from our criteria, and now we're looking at, can we use our K-12 accountability assessment? So doing a better job of trying our K-12 up into our higher ed. And so we've just implemented our new policy for direct admissions that includes an or. So you're either getting in based on an academic performance based on GPA or your performance on our K-12 accountability assessment. And so that has been a monumental shift for us, is we're sort of what our colleges call, we're finding those diamonds in the rough, right? Those kids that are really capable of showing that they've met our high school learning outcomes and are going to be successful in our college situations. But I really think it is these giant systems, and it's just being willing to take and know that it's like one step at a time, right? Like you get to one place, you reassess, you take 2 steps forward. And I think that's the hardest thing, is we've just lived in really big systems, and it just takes a lot of willpower to move those systems forward.
Well said. I could ask this group a million questions all day long, but I'd love to turn to your questions. So I believe there are a few mic runners in this large room. If you all have some questions, please put your hand up and feel free to shoot anything you've got to any one of these individual panelists.
And while we're waiting, I actually have a question for a couple of the panelists. So something keeps me up at night. So let's say that David Troutman logs in, provides his information, he's automatically admitted into 10 institutions. Then the next step is to go to an application center to provide additional information. That could result in $750 of application fees. So with direct admissions, how are the other states wrestling with charging students an application fee through direct admissions?
I'll speak up for Idaho. So we ran our direct admissions program the first year, and we didn't have a common application. So kids were getting these letters. We were doing our college application week events, and our executive director was in there watching kids try to take advantage of, oh, I got into these 3 schools, I want to do an application, but there's no way I can do it within this 30-minute class period. And I'm duplicatively adding information constantly. So we built Apply Idaho. That's our common application, is only for our high school seniors. It is basically the sister program to direct admissions. And in order to do that, we said, we're going to have you on board in here, but there are not going to be, if a student submits an application through Apply Idaho, there's not going to be an application fee. And so in order to have all of our institutions get on board with that, the board actually paid the institutions for 2 years. You have 2 years to figure out how you're going to go if a student forever is going to go through Apply Idaho, that there's not an admission fee. And I will say that that has actually trickled over into some of our private institutions. So to be competitive with our public institutions, if a kid does Apply Idaho, there is no application fee, and it's open October through June. So now 2 of our big private schools also, for all incoming students, whether they use Apply Idaho or their individual applications, it's a free application fee. Our next thing to deal with is the transcripting, because we have a giant dual credit program where our students get about $6,500 a year from the state from 7th through 12th grade. And so now we're trying to tackle that whole fee for transcripts so that we can help reduce that barrier as well for students. But that's how Idaho did it.
Yeah, for David, for us, because it's Northern Arizona University and 9 of the community college districts voluntarily working together. And really what we've done is we send them out a co-branded letter. We let them know that they still have a pathway to a 4-year degree. We tell them they can choose among the 9 community college districts about where they want to start. And in addition to that, when they do decide to come to NAU, they are welcome with open arms, and they don't have to pay or apply again. We keep all that information, and we call it a day in terms of the fee.
Questions from the audience? I think we have time for about 1 question. No pressure.
Can't see.
That would be a doozy.
There's
I think there's
There's a hand.
you just want to stand up and yell it out. We might get a mic to you in time, but
Do you see any state-generated policies? Any state-generated policies or legislative pieces that are barriers that have to be dealt with as well? For example, in Texas, we have 42 credit hours that are required as our core or gen ed competencies. So that leaves only 6 courses that a community college student could take towards their academic program transfer process. And if the student sees that up front, they might say, why not spread out my gen ed across everything and go ahead to the 4-year if I'm going to go at all. And if we are also thinking about the possibility of 3-year degrees, as they're doing in some areas, the higher number of gen ed courses you have to take, it makes it more difficult to squeeze all of the content into 3 years.
I give you a couple of examples of hard policy but soft policy. So one of the things in Arizona as it relates to high school graduation requirements is that there were 16 courses. Now, we found that 2 out of those 16 courses were often not offered in many of our rural school districts or school districts at a high proportion of folks who were already speaking a foreign language. So they came from Hispanic backgrounds and still had a foreign language requirement. So we're working with the state to do a pilot where we are effectively allowing them to take 14 of those 16 courses. And we're seeing great success in terms of broader access and broader application rates. The other thing I would just mention to you is beyond the state legislature, it's really important to have a clear-eyed view of the broader ecosystem that you're in. Now, Texas is a fairly complex one with a coordinating board, numerous higher education systems, a ton of vested stakeholders. Think about how those things interact with one another, and think about whether or not the incentives exist to promote college going or not. For example, in Arizona, our superintendents have no incentive to promote college going among their high school students. Without that, that's going to create some serious and formidable barriers to, as David was noting and as Sarah was noting before, getting into the high schools or deeper to begin to tout the value of a degree. And if there's no incentive for the high schools to do that or community colleges to do that, then you've got to ask yourself, who's going to put the time, effort, energy, and resources into it? And guess what? If you want those folks to enroll in your institutions, it's going to be you. And so you're going to have to think more and more about recruitment strategies that are really based on making up for the fact that the incentives are misaligned or in some cases don't exist. And those are as important as state policy in many cases.
Dave, I'll give you the last word and then we'll wrap.
So one word that we're trying to use in 25 is portability, and making sure, I know an AC of mine, Elizabeth Mayer, is working on a transfer initiative with the 2 years and 4 years to identify, based on the major, a series of courses that both the 2 years and 4 years will accept when transfer. And I think if we can sort of take bite-sized pieces of the curriculum to make sure that those courses are automatically going to be accepted, and not accepted as elective, but actually accepted towards the degree plan, is going to solve part of the problem.
Great. Please join me in giving a round of applause for our amazing panelists. And with that, we are over time, so I'm going to turn it back to the coordinating board team.